For in the morning, Manchester, 1832. A bell is ringing over rooftops that have no business making noise this early, and nobody in the street below stops to ask why. They already know. Behind one of those doors, a girl of 9 is pulling on the same dress she fell asleep in the night before because she never really took it off. She has 40 minutes to reach the mill gate. 5 minutes late costs her a full day's wages. There are no street lamps worth mentioning on this route, so the children find each other by sound. Clogs on cobblestone, a cough, a low mutter of complaint, and slowly a little procession forms in the dark. Dozens of small shapes moving the same direction without needing to be told which one. Some of them are 6 years old. Nobody finds that strange. It is simply what a Tuesday looks like here, and it has looked like this for as long as anyone in this street can remember. At the gate stands the overseer, watch in hand, checking names against a board as bodies file past him into the noise. He is not cruel by his own account, merely responsible for output, and output does not forgive a late child any more than it forgives a broken thread. The gate itself will be locked once the shift starts. Nobody strolls out for air. Whatever happens on the other side of that door happens to everyone equally for the next 12 or 14 hours. And then the noise. Not a sound so much as a wall, thousands of spindles turning at once inside a single room. A roar so constant that workers stop hearing it as sound within a week and start feeling it instead, in the teeth, in the sternum. People here talk by reading lips because shouting simply does not reach across the floor. Ask an old mill hand a question and watch the eyes go to your mouth before the ears even try. Our 9-year-old is what the mill calls a piecer. Her job is to duck beneath the spinning mule, a carriage of moving thread that rolls out on rails and rolls back in again, and reknot any strand that has snapped with her fingers while the machine keeps moving. There is no switch anyone bothers to flip for this. Stopping the frame costs the owner money measured in seconds, and a child's hand is, in the plain arithmetic of the mill, considerably cheaper than a minute of idle machinery. Beneath the same machine, smaller children work as scavengers, sent crawling into the gap under the moving carriage to sweep loose cotton fluff before it jams the works. They are chosen for the job precisely because they are small enough to fit into a space no adult could enter, which tells you something about how this system prices a body. The younger you are, the more useful your smallness becomes, right up until the moment it isn't, and the machine simply takes what it takes. Years later, testimony collected for a parliamentary inquiry will describe exactly what that taking looked like. A girl's scalp torn away when her hair caught in an unguarded shaft. A boy's arm drawn into rollers up to the shoulder before anyone could reach the lever. These are not the horror stories told to frighten children straight. They are the ordinary casualty reports of an ordinary Tuesday, filed without much ceremony, because a missing finger on the mill floor draws less comment than a missing button. To keep the smaller children moving through the 14th hour, some overseers use a stick known on the floor as the billy roller, a short length of wood applied to the shoulders, the back, wherever it lands. Others prefer a leather strap. A few, it is recorded without much apparent shame, dunk a child's head in a water trough to shock them back awake rather than lose production to a nodding 6-year-old. None of this required a law to forbid it, because in 1832 no such law yet existed. The shift itself runs somewhere between 12 and 16 hours, depending on the season and the order book, 6 days out of 7, with meal breaks measured in minutes rather than an hour anyone would recognize as rest. Workers eat standing near the machine, and the bread comes seasoned whether they like it or not with a fine layer of cotton dust that settles on everything in the room, including the lungs that will spend the next 40 years trying to cough it back out. That dust has no name yet either. Decades from now, doctors will call the disease it causes bisonosis, and mill towns will simply call it the mill cough, the wheeze you can hear from 3 streets away on a winter morning. In 1832, it is just a fact of the body, like the way standing 12 hours a day on stone bends a growing child's legs into a shape no one would call natural. Bow legs, curved spines, a whole generation quietly reshaped by where it was made to stand. Some of the smallest children on this floor are not even here by their family's daily choice. They are pauper apprentices, sent from parish workhouses under contracts that bind them to a mill owner for years at a stretch, fed and housed in exchange for labor, owned in every practical sense but the legal one. Nobody asked them. The parish needed fewer mouths, the mill needed more hands, and the arrangement suited both sides of a transaction the child had no seat at. There is no inspector coming today. No one from London is standing in the doorway with a notebook, because the office that will eventually employ such a person does not exist yet, and will not for another year at least, and even then it will send 4 men to cover the whole of industrial England. Whatever happens on this floor between 4 in the morning and 8 at night happens entirely unwitnessed by anyone with the power to stop it. For all of this, she is paid perhaps 2 or 3 shillings a week, and by law that money is not even hers. It belongs to her father, the head of the household, because a child's earnings in 1832 are treated as his property, not hers. A grown man on the same floor might earn 10 times as much and still struggle to cover rent, bread, and coal. Her few shillings are not spending money. Some weeks they're the entire difference between the family eating and not eating at all. Sunday is technically a day off, and it is worth being precise about what that actually means. No mill bell, true, but there's mending to do, water to carry, younger siblings to mind, and in many households a compulsory walk to church where the sermon frequently praises the very industry currently wearing out the congregation's children. Rest, as anyone outside a mill town would recognize it, simply is not on offer. It is a pause in one kind of labor, filled immediately with another. One of these children grew up to write it all down. Robert Blincoe, a parish orphan sent to a Nottinghamshire mill as a pauper apprentice, published his memoir in 1832, the same year our composite scene is set, describing beatings, starvation, and machinery that took part of his ear and left him permanently disfigured. Critics at the time accused him of exaggeration, of writing propaganda for people with an agenda. He simply answered that he had lived it and dared anyone to prove otherwise. Multiply this single mill by every town whose name now sounds like a machine part. Oldham, Bolton, Stockport, Rochdale. By 1832, Lancashire alone holds hundreds of cotton mills. Most run on some version of the same floor plan, the same bell, the same arithmetic that prices a child's fingers below a minute of machine time. This was never one bad employer in one unlucky town. It was the operating model of an entire industry, running at full capacity every single morning before the sun came up. When the final bell finally rings, our 9-year-old walks home in darkness again, having spent an entire winter day, start to finish, without once standing in daylight. Her eyes take a moment to adjust to a night sky already thick with coal smoke, and she will do this again tomorrow, and the day after, for years, because this is not an emergency. It is simply her life, and the lives of tens of thousands of children exactly like her across the mill towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment. Tens of thousands, not a handful of unlucky cases in one badly run mill, but a working method replicated with only minor variation across an entire region, because it was profitable and because nothing yet on the statute book said it had to stop. The 9-year-old at the center of this chapter is a composite stitched together from testimony given years later by children who lived through exactly this. She's not one story. She is thousands, wearing one face for convenience. What should unsettle you is not any single detail here. It is the total absence of alarm in the room while it was happening. No one on that mill floor in 1832 believed they were witnessing a scandal. The overseer went home to his own dinner. The owner reviewed his output figures and found them satisfactory. The machine did not pause to consider what it was running on, because machines do not, and in 1832, almost nothing forced the people who owned it to consider that question either. So the real question this story has to answer is not what happened on that floor. That part is documented, witnessed, beyond dispute. The real question is how an entire society arrived at a place where sending a 9-year-old under a running machine before sunrise counted as simply how things were done. And that answer does not start in the mill at all. It starts outdoors, on a stretch of common land that families like hers had farmed freely for longer than anyone could remember. A family in Northamptonshire wakes one morning in the 1780s to find a fence running straight through what used to be the parish common, the stretch of open ground where their cow has grazed for 3 generations. Nobody consulted them. Nobody had to. Parliament passed the act, surveyors drove the stakes, and by the time anyone in the village finished breakfast, ground their grandparents' grazed animals on freely was, in the strict language of the law, somebody else's private property. Before this, English rural life ran on a system that predates the Normans in places. Open fields split into scattered strips worked by different families. Common pasture where anyone in the parish could graze a cow or a few geese, and a set of customary rights with names most modern ears have never heard. Estovers, the right to gather firewood. Turbary, the right to cut peat for fuel. Gleaning, the right of the poor to walk a harvested field afterward and collect whatever grain the reapers missed. None of this made anyone rich. It made them, crucially, independent of a wage. A category with grazing rights, a garden plot, and access to the common woods could feed a family through a bad year without asking a single employer for a single extra shilling. That independence is precisely what enclosure quietly ended, parish by parish, one private act of parliament at a time. And it is worth noticing that independence from wages is not something any employer has ever mourned losing on someone else's behalf. The mechanism itself sounds almost bureaucratically boring, which is part of how it worked. A local landowner petitions Parliament for a private act covering one specific parish. Commissioners are appointed to redraw the map, consolidating scattered strips into single, efficient blocks and awarding them to whoever can produce a legal document proving ownership. Sounds fair enough, until you remember that most cottagers never held a legal document for rights their families had simply exercised, unquestioned, for 200 years. Between roughly 1750 and 1830, Parliament passed more than 5,000 of these private enclosure acts, reshaping something on the order of 7 million acres of English countryside, an area larger than several European countries put together. Each act, individually, looks like a minor administrative footnote. Stacked 5,000 high, they amount to the single largest legal transfer of land in English history, conducted almost entirely without the consent of the people who actually lived on it. Even families who technically won something out of the process often lost in practice. A smallholder might be awarded a modest plot in exchange for surrendering scattered common rights, only to discover the legal fees and the cost of fencing his new, smaller property exceeded whatever that land could earn him in a decade. Selling to the larger landowner next door, the very man who had petitioned for the enclosure in the first place, was frequently the only arithmetic that made sense. The people with no legal title at all, squatters, cottagers, laborers who had simply always grazed a pig on the common because their grandfather had, got nothing. No compensation, no consultation, and no legal standing to object because the law being applied here was quite literally written by the men who stood to gain the most from applying it. It is difficult to imagine a more perfectly self-dealing arrangement, and nobody involved in drafting it seems to have found that strange. The poet John Clare grew up in one of these parishes, Helpstone, and lived through its enclosure as a young man. He spent the rest of his life writing, with real fury, about a landscape he said had been carved up and locked away from the people who once wandered it freely. He called the new boundary stones little tyrants, and meant it. History has generally filed him under nature poet. He would probably tell you he was writing an eyewitness account of a robbery. Supporters of enclosure had a genuinely respectable argument, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than dismissed. Consolidated fields allowed crop rotation, selective livestock breeding, and drainage improvements that the old scattered strip system made nearly impossible to coordinate. Agricultural output did rise. England's population was climbing fast enough that the old system, left alone, might well have struggled to feed everyone. The tragedy is not that anyone lied about the benefits. It is that almost none of those benefits reached the people who paid the price for them. Parish poor relief records from this period tell their own quiet story. In parishes freshly enclosed, the number of families applying for relief tends to climb noticeably within a few years, as households that once fed themselves from common land found they could no longer make ends meet through the lean months. The very system meant to handle the poor was, in effect, absorbing the casualties of a policy decided at Westminster by men who would never see the parishes they were reshaping. Consider what this actually removed from a family's margin of safety. Lose the cow, lose the milk and the occasional calf sold at market. Lose the gleaning rights, lose the grain that used to stretch the household through late winter. Lose the wood gathering, and firewood now has to be bought instead of cut. None of these losses individually sounds catastrophic. Together they strip away every backup a family had, leaving one single source of income standing where 3 or 4 used to be. That one remaining source of income is a wage, paid by somebody else on somebody else's schedule, for work on somebody else's land or, increasingly, inside somebody else's building. A family that once answered mainly to the weather and the seasons now answers to an employer. An employer's interests in a family's survival do not automatically point the same direction. This is the quiet mechanism connecting a fence common in Northamptonshire to a mill floor in Manchester, decades and sometimes a generation apart. It would be tidy to say every displaced Cottager marched directly into a factory town, and it would also be wrong. Many stayed on the land as landless laborers, working for wages on the very farms their families used to share in common. But their children, and especially their grandchildren, faced a countryside that could no longer absorb a growing population with no land of its own. The mill towns did not have to recruit very hard. Enclosure had already done the recruiting for them, one fenced field at a time. Not everyone accepted this quietly. In scattered parishes across the 1760s and again in the 1790s, villagers pulled down the new fences at night, filled in freshly dug boundary ditches, and generally tried to physically undo what the surveyors had done during the day. It rarely worked for long, and it was punished harshly when caught, but it establishes something worth remembering. Long before anyone smashed a spinning frame in protest, English communities were already breaking fences to defend a way of life they could feel slipping away. Meanwhile, the winners of this arrangement did rather well for themselves. Landowners who consolidated their holdings could rent out larger, more efficient farms at higher rates, and agricultural rents across England climbed substantially through this period. Some of that new wealth, inconveniently for anyone hoping for a tidy villain, would later be reinvested in canals, turnpikes, and eventually the very mills this story keeps circling back to. The gentry did not simply profit from enclosure. In quite a few cases, they used the proceeds to help build the next chapter's machines. Women bore a particular share of this loss that the official records rarely bothered itemizing. Gleaning after harvest, informal spinning using wool from common grazed sheep, small-scale dairying from common-fed cow. These were frequently a woman's own independent income inside the household economy, separate from her husband's wage. Enclosure did not just cost families a cow. For many wives and widows specifically, it quietly erased the one form of earning that had belonged to them alone. John Clare's own village of Helpstone was formally enclosed in 1809, under an act he watched pass through Parliament as a young man with no vote and no say in the matter whatsoever. He would later write that he felt as though he had woken up in a country he no longer recognized, though the hills and the trees had not physically moved an inch. Only the fences had moved, and the fences, it turned out, were the whole point. So picture the 9-year-old from the mill floor again, and picture her grandfather, decades earlier, watching a surveyor drive stakes in a ground his family had grazed animals on since before anyone could remember. He never set foot inside a cotton mill. He did not need to. He simply lost the one thing that would have kept his descendants out of one. And by the time his granddaughter was born, the choice had already narrowed itself down to almost nothing at all. For most of human history, a building simply went dark when the sun did. Candles and rushlights were expensive, tallow was precious, and no sensible person burned fuel to keep working past dusk unless the harvest itself was on fire. Then, in 1771, a barber-turned-entrepreneur named Richard Arkwright opened a mill at Cromford in Derbyshire that broke this rule entirely, and did it on purpose because the machine inside it did not care whether the sun was up. Before Arkwright, English working life ran on what historians call task time rather than clock time. You plowed until the field was done, not until a bell said stop. Church bells marked the rough canonical hours of the day, dawn prayer, midday, evening, but nobody expected precision from them, and nobody's pay depended on arriving at the third stroke rather than the fifth. Time was a general sense of where you were in the day. It was about to become something you could be fined for losing. Arkwright's water frame, the machine he patented in 1769, spun cotton thread faster and more consistently than any hand spinner alive, but needed one thing a human worker never required: a river that kept flowing regardless of the hour. Water does not clock out at sunset, so Arkwright built his mill to run continuously, day and night, and simply hired enough workers to cover the hours the water itself never stopped moving. The machine set the schedule. The people arranged themselves around it. This is where night shifts, as we understand them, essentially begin. Workers at Cromford were organized into relays, one crew replacing another at the machines without the frames themselves ever falling silent. And some accounts from the period describe children being carried to the mill still half asleep, so as not to waste a single minute of the changeover between shifts. A child's own sleep, in this arrangement, mattered rather less than the water wheel's uninterrupted turning. The economic logic here is colder than it sounds, and worth spelling out plainly. A field left untended overnight loses nothing. A water wheel in a room full of expensive machinery left idle overnight loses money every single minute, because the capital sunk into iron and gearing sits there depreciating whether it spins or not. Once a factory owner has borrowed heavily to build something this costly, idle machinery stops being a peaceful absence of work and starts being an active financial wound. James Watt changed the equation again in the 1780s, when his improved steam engine learned to produce smooth rotary motion instead of the simple up and down pumping his earlier designs were built for. Paired with his business partner Matthew Boulton's manufacturing skill, this new engine no longer needed a river at all. Feed it coal, and it would turn machinery anywhere a cart could deliver fuel, which meant a mill no longer had to be built beside a stream in the countryside. It could be built wherever the owner wanted, at whatever scale he could afford. Owners quickly discovered that the clock itself could be quietly bent to their advantage. Workers in this period commonly complained of mill clocks that ran fast in the morning to dock latecomers and slow in the evening to steal extra minutes of labor before the bell finally released them, a practice specific enough to earn its own nickname on the factory floor. There was, in most of these towns, exactly one clock that mattered, and the person who controlled it was very rarely the person standing at the machine. The factory bell itself began doing work a church bell used to do, and in a number of mill towns it did so with a startling literalness. Mounted in a tower built to look almost exactly like the steeple, it was replacing as the sound that organized an entire community's day. The difference is what the bell was now calling people toward. Not prayer, a production quota owned by a shareholder most of the ringing bell's listeners would never once meet in person. Lateness stopped being a minor social embarrassment and became a documented, punishable offense with its own paperwork. Many mills kept in and out boards recording exactly when each worker crossed the threshold, and some posted the names of persistent latecomers where the whole floor could read them, a small, deliberate exercise in public shame layered on top of the wage already docked. The goal was not merely punctuality. It was total, unthinking obedience to a schedule that had nothing to do with a human body's actual needs. Pre-industrial workers had also long observed something called St. Monday, an unofficial but widely tolerated custom of treating Monday as an extension of the weekend, particularly among skilled tradesmen who set their own hours. Factory owners despised this practice with real intensity, since a machine sitting idle on Monday morning cost exactly as much as one sitting idle on Thursday, and much of the early history of workplace discipline is, bluntly, the story of stamping St. Monday out of the English working week entirely. There is even evidence the human body itself was rearranged by this shift. Historical researchers studying diaries, court records, and medical texts from before this period have found repeated references to a first sleep and a second sleep, a natural nighttime pattern broken by an hour or two of quiet waking activity in the middle of the night. That segmented pattern largely vanishes from the historical record as factory shift time spread, replaced by the single unbroken block of sleep the clock now demanded and the alarm now enforced. None of the men building this system thought of themselves as reprogramming the human nervous system. They thought they were running an efficient business, and by the metrics available to them, they were entirely correct. Arkwright died in 1792, one of the wealthiest commoners in England, knighted for his trouble. He never had to ask what all that continuous clock-governed labor cost the people producing it, because in the arithmetic he was using, that question simply did not appear on a ledger. The poet William Blake gave this new landscape its most lasting nickname in 1804, writing of dark satanic mills in a poem most people quoting the phrase have never actually finished reading. Blake was not being vaguely poetic about progress in general. He meant buildings that ran through the night by candlelight and later by gas flame, producing goods for distant markets while quietly consuming something in the people working inside them that he genuinely believed resembled damnation. History has mostly kept the phrase and dropped the accusation buried inside it. By the year 1800, something on the order of 500 Bolton and Watt engines were already turning machinery across Britain, and that number kept climbing every single year afterward. Cotton had simply gotten there first. Within a generation, the same clock-governed, bell-disciplined model spread into potteries, ironworks, and breweries, anywhere an owner could borrow enough capital to build a machine too expensive to ever let sit idle. Josiah Wedgwood, the pottery manufacturer, is one of the best documented examples of this discipline spreading well beyond textiles. His Staffordshire works ran on a bell, fined workers for lateness with a precision that survives in his own account books, and even experimented with an early version of a time clock to track exactly when each employee arrived. Wedgwood made teacups, not thread, and he arrived at the identical conclusion Arkwright had. A machine, once built, should never have to wait for a human being. What Arkwright, and what had actually built, without quite meaning to, was a new kind of gravity. Machinery, this expensive and this productive, did not simply sit in a field somewhere, running quietly on its own. It pulled people toward it, out of villages and off the newly enclosed farms from the last chapter, faster than anyone had planned for and considerably faster than any town's roads, water supply, or graveyards were prepared to handle. A French visitor to Manchester in 1835, the political thinker Alexis de Tocqueville, wrote that he could scarcely tell whether it was morning or evening from inside the city, because a permanent haze hung over everything, thick enough to dim the sun itself. He was not exaggerating for effect. Manchester by this point burned coal in such staggering quantity that visitors from cleaner cities regularly described the sky above it as a kind of perpetual, man-made twilight. It is worth pausing on how fast this actually happened, because the speed is most of the horror. Manchester held perhaps 10,000 people at the start of the 18th century, a modest market town of no particular note. By 1801, it held roughly 75,000. By 1831, it had passed 140,000 and kept climbing from there. A city can build a cathedral in that span of time. It cannot build sewers, water mains, and enough housing for a population that has multiplied 14 times over. Nothing resembling modern city government existed to manage any of this. Local administration still ran, in most places on structures designed centuries earlier for small rural parishes, a part-time constable here, a handful of unpaid vestry officials there, entirely unequipped to plan streets, licensed builders, or lay pipes for a population exploding at industrial speed. The people arrived faster than any institution capable of organizing them could even be invented. So building happened the way it always happens when nobody is in charge, quickly, cheaply, and wherever there is open ground. Speculative builders threw up row after row of housing with no drains, often no water supply beyond a single shared pump for an entire street, packed as tightly as the ground would allow, because every square foot left empty was rent not collected. The result was a city built almost entirely by people optimizing for one number, and it was never public health. The rivers running through these towns tell their own story. Manchester's River Irk ran different colors on different days depending on which dye the nearby mills were using that week. Sometimes a livid red, sometimes an unnatural blue, thick with waste and largely devoid of anything that could still be called fish. People downstream drew drinking water from sources not far removed from the same industrial runoff, an arrangement nobody had planned so much as simply allowed to happen by never planning anything at all. Manchester earned the nickname Cottonopolis for a reason, but it was hardly alone. Leeds grew fat on wool in almost exactly the same unplanned way. Birmingham built itself instead around thousands of small metalworking shops rather than a handful of giant mills, earning its own nickname, the workshop of the world, while producing buttons, nails, and guns in conditions barely less punishing than a Manchester cotton floor. Sheffield did the same for steel and cutlery. Each city found its own product. Every one of them found the identical solution of unregulated, breakneck growth. A significant share of the new arrivals were Irish, pushed out by agricultural hardship and rural poverty well before the catastrophic famine of the 1840s made that migration into a flood. They tended to settle in the very cheapest, most crowded corners of these cities, and English observers frequently treated their presence as evidence of some inherent Irish squalor, rather than as the entirely predictable result of arriving poor into cities that offered poor arrivals nothing but the worst housing available at any price. Walk into one of these cities from the surrounding countryside in, say, 1820, and a sensory assault would have been genuinely disorienting. The noise of thousands of machines running simultaneously, the smell of coal smoke mixed with industrial dye and untreated sewage, the sheer density of human bodies moving through streets never designed to hold them. People raised on farms, where the nearest neighbor might be visible only as smoke from a distant chimney, were suddenly living stacked on top of dozens of strangers, breathing air that had already passed through someone else's lungs in a factory's furnace first. None of the men profiting from this growth were unaware of the conditions it was producing. Reports describing filthy streets, contaminated water, and dangerously overcrowded housing were published, discussed, and largely set aside as the unfortunate but unavoidable cost of progress, a phrase that tends to appear most often in the mouths of people who do not personally have to live with the cost in question. What this arrangement was quietly incubating in cellar after crowded cellar would not stay contained to the poor for very much longer. Contemporary guidebooks, meanwhile, sold a rather different Manchester to outside visitors, one full of admiring counts of its factory chimneys, its warehouses, its sheer productive scale, describing the city as a marvel of the modern age worth traveling to see. Both descriptions were true at once, the marvel and the choking haze, and they were true of the exact same streets. Boosters simply chose to write about the view from a hillside, while the people living inside the haze itself rarely got a guidebook written from their vantage point at all. It will not surprise you to learn that the wealthy arranged their own housing with the wind in mind. Where the geography allowed it, the better neighborhoods sat upwind and uphill of the mills and the worst slums, so that smoke and stench drifted reliably away from the people who could afford to choose where they lived and settled instead over the people who could not. This was rarely written down as policy. It did not need to be. Property values did the sorting on their own, street by street. The mortality numbers, even in their crudest form, tell you who paid for this arrangement. Statisticians compiling figures in the 1840s found that the average age at death in a place like Manchester sat dramatically below the average in a quiet rural county not far away, a gap wide enough that simply being born in the wrong town functioned, in effect, as a sentence. Nobody signed that sentence. The geography of coal, capital, and cheap land signed it for them. A young German named Friedrich Engels arrived in Manchester in 1842 to help manage his father's textile business. And instead of simply collecting the profits, he began walking the poorest streets, taking notes, and asking questions the guidebooks never asked. What he was quietly gathering would eventually become one of the most damning first-hand accounts of industrial city life ever written. For now, in this chapter, he is simply one more well-dressed man walking through a haze that everyone around him had long since stopped noticing. And every single one of these packed, smoke-choked streets kept producing exactly what the mills further up the road always needed more of: bodies. Cheap ones, replaceable ones, and above all small ones, because a city this desperate rarely left a family much choice about which of its members went to work and how young they started. A mill owner, giving evidence years later, would explain his preference for child labor with a bluntness that still lands oddly on modern ears. Children's fingers, he said, simply reach into places a grown man's hands cannot, and children can be trained to the work faster and paid a fraction of what an adult would demand for the same task. He did not appear to consider this shameful. He considered it sound business, and by the standards of his ledger, he was not wrong. The wage table made the logic explicit. A skilled adult male spinner might earn somewhere around 10 to 15 shillings a week. A woman doing comparable work often earned roughly half that. A child doing work that was frequently just as dangerous and every bit as exhausting might bring home 2 or 3 shillings, sometimes less, for the very same number of hours standing at the very same machine. The mill was not simply hiring cheap labor. It was systematically hiring the cheapest labor it could physically fit through the door. Doffing was one of the specific jobs children were prized for, swapping full bobbins of spun thread for empty ones on a running frame, fast, repetitive, and requiring hands small enough to work in tight spaces between moving parts without slowing the machine down. A good doffer worked at a speed that would exhaust an adult within the hour. Mill owners simply hired children instead of paying anyone enough to make the job humane. Outside the mills, an entirely separate industry was running an even darker version of the same arithmetic. Chimney sweeps, known on the street as climbing boys, were sent up flues as young as 4 or 5 years old, small enough to wriggle through passages sometimes barely 9 inches across, scraping soot loose with their bare elbows and knees because no brush yet invented could reach where a child's own body could. Training a climbing boy, in the plain language sweep masters actually used, sometimes involved lighting a small fire beneath a hesitant child to encourage faster climbing, or pricking the soles of bare feet with pins from below when a boy froze partway up a narrow flue. Some children became genuinely stuck, wedged into a bend too tight to pass, and a documented number of them suffocated or died of injuries sustained trying to free themselves before anyone below even realized they were in danger. Parliament actually tried to address this as early as 1788, passing an act that nominally set a minimum age and required an apprenticeship agreement for climbing boys. It changed almost nothing in practice because it carried no real enforcement mechanism and no inspector tasked with checking a single chimney anywhere in the country. A law that nobody is paid to enforce is, functionally, a suggestion, and sweep masters treated it exactly that way for decades afterward. In 1775, the London Surgeon Percival Pott had already identified something disturbing among adult men who had worked as climbing boys in their youth, a cancer specific to soot-exposed skin that later doctors would simply call chimney sweeps cancer. It stands as one of the very first occupational cancers ever formally documented in medical history. the evidence that this trade was slowly killing its own children, in other words, existed in print for well over half a century before anyone with real power acted on it. Sweepmasters frequently acquire their climbing boys the way one might acquire livestock, paying poor families a few shillings outright for a son, or collecting orphans directly from parish workhouses eager to reduce the number of mouths on their books. Once purchased in this manner, a child had essentially no recourse and no family nearby willing or able to intervene on his behalf. He belonged, in every meaningful sense but the strictly legal one, to whoever had paid for him. The mills ran their own version of this same transaction through the pauper apprentice system, shipping orphaned and poor children from workhouses to rural mills by the wagon load, where they lived in dormitories called apprentice houses attached directly to the factory, worked without wages in exchange for food and a bed, and remained legally bound until they turned 21. Cromford itself, Arkwright's own mill from an earlier chapter, ran on exactly this arrangement for a portion of its workforce. Decades later, Army recruiters trying to fill regiments during the Crimean War found something quietly damning in their own enlistment records. Young men from industrial mill towns were, on average, noticeably shorter and less physically developed than recruits pulled from rural counties the enclosures had emptied out a generation earlier. Childhood spent standing on stone floors, breathing cotton dust and coal smoke, and going hungry on a child's wage had measurably stunted an entire generation's growth, and the Army's own paperwork proved it without meaning to. The one piece of legislation that did exist by this point, the 1802 Act regulating pauper apprentices, applied only to children bound through a parish, and owners found the loophole almost immediately. Simply hire children directly from their own parents instead, paying a wage rather than binding an apprentice, and the entire law became irrelevant to your mill. Free children, as the law rather coldly distinguished them from pauper apprentices, could be worked exactly as hard, for exactly as long, with no legal protection whatsoever. Doctors of the period came to recognize a climbing boy on sight by the permanent calluses and scarring built up on his knees and elbows from years of bracing his own weight against brick, a mark the trade left on the body that never fully went away, even for boys who survived long enough to age out of the chimneys. It functioned almost as an occupational signature, visible proof of exactly which trade had shaped a particular child, stamped directly onto the skin. Renovators demolishing old buildings decades later occasionally found small skeletons lodged inside disused flues, remains of climbing boys who had become fatally stuck and were simply never recovered, sealed instead behind brickwork that outlived them by generations. It is one of the quieter horrors of this period that a child could die at work and, in some documented cases, simply remain part of the building afterward, undiscovered until the house itself was finally torn down. Parliamentary estimates from the early decades of the 19th century suggested that in a great many cotton mills, children under 18 made up something close to 2/3 of the entire workforce standing on the floor at any given hour. This was never a marginal practice tucked away in a few disreputable operations. In a significant share of English mills, the child was not the exception on the payroll. The child was the payroll. Mill owners rarely described any of this in the cold language of cost-cutting when speaking publicly. Idleness, they liked to argue, was the true danger facing poor children, a moral corruption that honest labor alone could cure. And a mill floor, therefore, did the Christian charity of keeping small hands busy and small souls out of trouble. It is a strikingly convenient piece of moral reasoning, arriving at exactly the conclusion that happened to be most profitable for the person making the argument. Girls working the mill floor faced a further danger that rarely made it into official reports at all. Overseers who held total, unchecked authority over a young worker's hours, her wages, and whether she kept her job at all. Testimony collected later, once Parliament finally began asking, includes accounts of exactly the abuse of power you would expect wherever adults hold that much unsupervised control over children with nowhere else to turn. It was spoken of quietly at the time, when it was spoken of at all. What should stay with you from this chapter is not any single injury or any single sweetmaster's cruelty. It is the sheer, unremarkable ordinariness of the whole arrangement, repeated in city after city, industry after industry, because a child's body was, quite simply, the cheapest machine part available on the market, and nothing yet compelled anyone to price it any differently. In the dead of night in November 1811, a group of masked men broke into a workshop near Nottingham and systematically smashed every stocking frame inside it, working with the calm efficiency of people who had planned this carefully rather than a mob acting on sudden rage. By morning, the machines lay in pieces, the men were gone, and a movement that would terrify the British establishment for the next 5 years had effectively just begun. The people doing this breaking were not, contrary to how the word Luddite gets used today, simple-minded enemies of progress or machinery in general. Framework knitters, croppers, and weavers were skilled tradesmen, men who had served years of apprenticeship, took real pride in their craft, and had historically earned a respectable living from it. What they were attacking, specifically, were machines being used to flood the market with cheap, poorly made goods produced by unapprenticed labor at a fraction of the wage their skill had always commanded. The movement took its name from a possibly mythical figure, Ned Ludd, said to have smashed a stocking frame himself back in 1779 in a fit of frustration. Nobody could ever quite prove he existed. That hardly mattered. Threatening letters sent to mill owners throughout the Rising were signed General Ludd or King Ludd, giving a scattered, leaderless movement a single symbolic face that authorities could never actually arrest because he had never actually been real. The Rising spread quickly beyond Nottinghamshire. In Yorkshire, croppers attacked the gig mills and shearing frames, threatening to replace their painstaking hand finishing of woolen cloth. In Lancashire, handloom weavers turned their anger on the new power looms multiplying across the county. Each region had its own specific machine to hate, but the underlying grievance stayed identical everywhere it appeared. Technology being deployed, not to make everyone's life easier, but specifically to cut a trade's wages and break its bargaining power. Many raids were more disciplined and more restrained than popular memory now suggests. Groups drilled at night with something close to military organization, and letters were frequently sent to mill owners beforehand, warning them to remove specific objectionable machines voluntarily or face the consequences. Owners who complied were often left alone entirely. This was not indiscriminate destruction. It was closer to a targeted labor dispute conducted quite deliberately with hammers instead of picket signs, because picket signs did not yet exist as a recognized form of protest. Parliament's answer arrived in February 1812 in the form of a bill making frame breaking a capital offense, punishable by hanging. One of the few members of the House of Lords to speak against it was the poet Lord Byron, delivering his first ever parliamentary speech, in which he argued that starving, desperate men should not be executed for destroying property when the country had done nothing to address the desperation driving them to it. The bill passed regardless. Byron's speech remains one of the more eloquent and more completely ignored warnings in the whole affair. The government's military response was, by any measure, extraordinary. At the height of the Rising, more soldiers were stationed across the industrial districts of England to suppress a few thousand armed weavers and knitters than the Duke of Wellington had under his command fighting Napoleon's army on the Iberian Peninsula at the very same moment. A domestic labor dispute, in the eyes of the British state, briefly outranked an actual foreign war as the greater threat to national security. Violence escalated in both directions through the spring of 1812. At Rawfolds Mill in Yorkshire, the owner William Cartwright had fortified his premises in advance and opened fire on an attacking crowd of Luddites, killing 2 of them outright. Days later, a group of croppers ambushed and shot dead a different mill owner, William Horsfall, in direct retaliation. What had started as targeted sabotage against machinery had, within months, become a cycle of actual killing on both sides of the dispute. The reckoning came in January 1813 at a special commission convened in York. Dozens of men were tried in rapid succession, and 17 of them were hanged, several in a single mass execution outside York Castle before a crowd gathered to watch. Some of the condemned were barely out of their teenage years. The state had made its point about as unambiguously as a government can make a point, using rope instead of argument. After York, the movement essentially collapsed. Scattered incidents continued for a couple more years, but the organized, disciplined campaign of 1811 and 1812 never really recovered from watching 17 of its own hang in public. The machines the Luddites had fought so hard to destroy stayed exactly where they were. Wages in the affected trades kept falling for years afterward, and framework knitting in particular never again returned to the standard of living it had briefly enjoyed before all of this began. The wage collapse the Luddites had tried to prevent arrived anyway, right on schedule. By the 1820s, framework knitters in Nottinghamshire were commonly earning less than half what the trade had paid before the rising began, and the flood of cheaper, machined finished goods they had fought to stop kept flowing regardless. Every man hanged outside York Castle had died, trying to prevent exactly the outcome that occurred within a decade of his death. The government's fear, underneath all the troop deployments, ran deeper than broken machinery. Luddites organized in secret, administered illegal oaths, and met at night in a manner that looked, to nervous officials in London, uncomfortably similar to the revolutionary societies that had toppled the French monarchy a generation earlier. The state responded accordingly, planting informants inside these networks and, in at least one well-documented later case involving similar unrest, using an agent provocateur to help engineer the very uprising he was then paid to help crush. That later case was the Pentridge Rising of June 1817, a small, badly organized armed march in Derbyshire led by a stocking maker named Jeremiah Brandreth, encouraged in part by a government agent who had assured the plotters that a much larger uprising was already underway elsewhere. It was not. Brandreth and 2 others were hanged and beheaded for treason, the last such beheadings carried out in England. The economic desperation that had fueled the Luddite years had clearly not gone anywhere. It had simply gone quiet, waiting for its next outlet. It is worth being precise about what the word Luddite has come to mean versus what these men were actually arguing. They were not reflexively frightened of new technology as an idea. They understood machinery perfectly well and, in plenty of documented cases, operated it themselves without complaint when the terms were fair. Their real objection was to a specific choice being made by specific owners to use new machines as a weapon for driving down wages and gutting apprenticeship standards, rather than as a tool for sharing the gains of new technology more broadly. History flattened that argument into a punchline about people afraid of gadgets, which is, frankly, a fairly convenient way to avoid engaging with what they were actually saying. By 1819, industrial Manchester had grown into one of the largest towns in England without gaining a single member of parliament to represent it, while a scattering of nearly empty villages elsewhere in the country, so-called rotten boroughs, kept sending representatives to Westminster on the strength of a handful of voters. A city that made the nation's cloth had, in the eyes of its own government, no political voice whatsoever. That grievance had been building for years by the time anyone called a meeting to actually say so out loud in public. The post-war years had made everything worse. Soldiers demobilized after Waterloo flooded back into a labor market already crushed by falling wages. The Corn Laws of 1815 kept bread prices artificially high to protect landowners, and handloom weavers watched their trade collapse under exactly the kind of mechanized competition the Luddites had failed to stop. Against that backdrop, a mass meeting was called for the 16th of August at St. Peter's Field to demand parliamentary reform through entirely lawful, entirely peaceful means. An estimated 60,000 people converged on that field, many walking in from surrounding towns in organized contingents, banners raised reading words like liberty, reform, and votes by ballot. Families came dressed deliberately in their finest clothes. Women's reform societies marched in white, and the entire tone of the gathering was calibrated, quite consciously, to demonstrate respectability and restraint rather than provoke confrontation. This was not a mob assembly. It was, by every visible measure, a peaceful political rally. The radical orator Henry Hunt had been invited to address the crowd, and it was the moment he rose to speak that the watching magistrates, stationed nervously in a house overlooking the field, decided to act. Rather than wait, they ordered his immediate arrest and instructed the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry, a volunteer cavalry unit made up largely of local shopkeepers and businessmen with minimal military training, to push through the packed crowd and take him into custody. It went wrong almost immediately. The yeomanry, mounted and inexperienced, found themselves swallowed and stuck inside a crowd far denser than they had planned for, and several accounts describe them drawing their sabers in what looks less like disciplined tactics than outright panic. Regular cavalry, the 15th Hussars, were then sent in with orders to extract the trapped yeomanry, and instead of a rescue, what followed was a mounted charge directly into a crowd that had nowhere to run, hemmed in on every side by walls and buildings. At least 18 people died that afternoon, including a 2-year-old boy struck down and a woman trampled while fleeing, and more than 600 were wounded, many by saber cuts, many more crushed in the desperate scramble to escape a field that had suddenly become a trap. The dead and wounded were not soldiers or armed riders. They were the same men, women, and children who had arrived that morning dressed in their best clothes specifically to prove they meant no violence at all. The name Peterloo was coined almost immediately afterward by the radical press, a deliberately bitter fusion of St. Peter's Field and Waterloo, the battle where many of these same cavalrymen's regiments had supposedly won glory fighting Napoleon 4 years earlier. The joke, such as it was, wrote itself. Soldiers who had once charged a French army were now being celebrated for charging their own unarmed countrymen in a field named after a saint. A young reporter named John Edward Taylor was present that day, and what he witnessed left him so disturbed by both the violence itself and the existing press's inadequate, often dishonest coverage of it, that he went on to help found an entirely new newspaper in Manchester the following year. That paper was the Manchester Guardian, an institution that exists to this day under a shortened name, born directly out of a massacre its founder had watched unfold in person. The government's response to all of this was not an inquiry into the magistrates or the cavalry. It was an official letter of thanks from the Prince Regent to the Manchester magistrates and the yeomanry, praising their prompt action in preserving public order. Later that same year, Parliament passed the 6 Acts, a package of laws further restricting public meetings, radical newspapers, and armed drilling, treating the massacre not as a scandal to investigate, but as a warning to enforce more thoroughly next time. Within minutes, the field itself told the story better than any newspaper could. Bonnets, shoes, and walking sticks lay scattered across churned ground where a peaceful crowd had stood only moments before, and the cries had shifted from political chanting to something far more desperate. Witnesses described a strange, sudden quiet settling over parts of the field once the horses had passed through, the particular silence of people too stunned to speak, checking their own bodies for wounds they had not yet noticed. One of the dead deserves a name and a particular kind of bitter attention. John Lees had fought at the actual Battle of Waterloo 4 years earlier and survived it. He died weeks after Peterloo from the wounds inflicted by cavalry sabers on English soil at a rally protesting the exact conditions his own government had left him to return home to. He reportedly told a friend, before he died, that Waterloo itself had been less frightening than what he experienced in that field named to mock his old battle. The coroner's inquest into Lees's death dragged on for weeks and was ultimately halted on a legal technicality before it could reach any formal verdict, sparing the authorities an official finding that might have named exactly who was responsible for killing a war veteran at a peaceful meeting. Henry Hunt himself was tried, convicted of unlawful assembly, and spent more than 2 years in prison, emerging afterward as enough of a public hero that he was eventually elected to Parliament, the very body that had refused to hear him before the sabers came out. Peterloo did not win reform for another generation. but it did permanently harden the reform movement's memory of what peaceful, lawful assembly had actually earned its participants. Grievances born in the enclosed fields, ground down further in the mills, and refused any voice at Westminster had now been answered, one more time, with a sword drawn in a crowd of families in their Sunday clothes. Whatever trust remained that the system might simply listen if asked politely enough had, for a great many people watching that day, finally run out. A parliamentary sanitary inspector touring a Manchester cellar in the 1830s counted 17 people sleeping in a single windowless room below street level, sharing one water pump with roughly 200 other households scattered across the surrounding court. He recorded the number without much editorializing, because by this point in his tour, 17 to a cellar had stopped being remarkable and started being simply what the street looked like, one door after another. The houses themselves were built to a design that maximized how many families a builder could cram onto a plot of land, literally back to back, sharing a rear wall with the house behind, which meant only one wall ever faced open air. No back door, no yard, no possibility of a draft passing through to clear out smoke, damp, or the smell of whatever was cooking or not being cooked in the room next door. Beneath many of these houses, landlords rented out the cellar as an entirely separate dwelling, often below the level of the street outside and prone to flooding whenever it rained heavily or a nearby privy overflowed, which in these neighborhoods happened often enough to barely qualify as news. Families living in these cellars existed permanently in the damp, sometimes literally standing water, with no natural light reaching them at any hour of the day. Clean water was not a household convenience here. It was a scheduled, ration event. Many streets shared a single standpipe that ran for only a limited number of hours on certain days of the week, forcing residents to store whatever water they could collect in open buckets and barrels that sat around for days afterward, quietly turning into exactly the kind of stagnant breeding ground you would design if you were deliberately trying to manufacture disease. Toilets, such as they were, meant a single shared privy, often little more than an open pit, serving dozens of families at once, and emptied irregularly by night soil men whose job it was to cart the waste away after dark. Between the runs, refuse simply accumulated in open heaps called middens, sitting in the same courtyards where children played and washing hung to dry, because there was quite literally nowhere else in these packed streets to put it. Friedrich Engels, the young factory manager from a previous chapter, spent considerable time documenting exactly this kind of neighborhood, most famously an area of Manchester known as Little Ireland, crowded into a bend of the polluted River Medlock. He described pools of filth standing permanently between the houses, air thick enough with stench to feel almost solid, and families living in conditions he flatly stated no domesticated animal in England would be kept in. He was not writing propaganda. He was, by most independent accounts from the period, writing it down fairly close to straight. Lodging houses added their own particular cruelty to the arithmetic of overcrowding, charging by the bed rather than the room, and in the cheapest establishments a single bed might be rented out in shifts. One worker climbing in as another climbed out to start a shift at the mill, the mattress itself never actually left empty long enough to properly cool. Strangers rotated through the same sheets around the clock, an arrangement landlords euphemistically priced as efficient use of space. None of this happened because building better housing was technically impossible. It happened because the people renting these rooms had no real alternative, and the people renting them out had absolutely no financial incentive to improve conditions that tenants would pay for regardless. Slum ownership was, in its own right, a genuinely profitable industry, and profitable industries in this story have an extremely consistent track record of resisting improvements nobody is forcing them to make. The factory owners whose mills these tenants worked infrequently lived close enough to see the smoke rising from exactly this kind of neighborhood, sometimes from the windows of their own considerably more comfortable houses on higher, better ventilated ground nearby. Visiting reformers and sanitary commissioners were, in a great many documented cases, the very first people of any social standing to actually walk these particular streets on foot and look closely at what their own city had built. One particular Manchester neighborhood, a warren of courts and cellars called Angel Meadow, earned itself a nickname from a visiting clergyman who simply described it as hell upon earth, and contemporary accounts back up the drama of that phrase with disturbingly specific detail. Unlit courtyards, communal privies overflowing into living spaces, and a population density that packed thousands of people into an area barely large enough for a modest modern city block. The name Angel Meadow, applied to a place like this, reads less like irony and more like a small, bitter joke nobody involved found particularly funny. Rent in these neighborhoods was rarely a modest household expense. Families frequently handed over a third or more of a working wage simply to occupy a single crowded room, leaving whatever remained to stretch across food, fuel, and clothing for everyone under that one roof. A rural cottage a generation earlier, whatever else it lacked, had rarely demanded this large a share of a family's total income just to keep a roof over their heads. Edwin Chadwick, a civil servant with an almost obsessive appetite for statistics, began compiling exactly this kind of housing data across multiple English towns in the early 1840s, room by room, court by court, building toward a report that would eventually connect filthy, overcrowded housing directly to sickness and early death in numbers precise enough that Parliament could no longer wave the problem away as mere unpleasantness. His findings on housing conditions alone, gathered chapter by chapter across this book's timeline, were already damning well before he ever needed to mention a single specific disease by name. Children raised in these rooms died of ordinary childhood ailments, diarrhea, fevers, chest infections at rates that any modern reader would recognize instantly as a humanitarian catastrophe rather than simply bad luck. Damp walls, contaminated water stored for days in an open bucket, and air shared by a dozen people in one unventilated room made almost any illness more dangerous than it needed to be, well before anyone in this neighborhood had ever heard the specific word that was about to arrive and make all of it very much worse. A dock worker in Sunderland, healthy enough to walk to work at dawn in the autumn of 1831, could be dead before the evening church bell rang, his body wrecked by violent vomiting and diarrhea so severe it drained him of fluid within hours. Doctors standing over these deaths, and there were many of them within just a few weeks, had absolutely no explanation to offer grieving families beyond guesses that would turn out to be almost entirely wrong. The disease had traveled a long road to reach that dock. Cholera originated in the river delta region of Bengal, and over the 1820s it moved steadily westward along trade routes and troop movements, through Russia, through continental Europe, arriving in Sunderland in October 1831 as Britain's first confirmed case. From a single port town, it spread outward through the winter and spring, following roads, canals, and rivers into exactly the crowded industrial towns this story has already spent several chapters describing. The dominant medical theory of the day held that disease traveled through foul-smelling air itself, a belief known as miasma theory, and it led doctors to recommend burning tar in the streets, scattering lime, and carrying vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs against the smell, all while the actual cause sat quietly in the water supply everyone kept drinking without a second thought. It would take more than 2 decades and a very different kind of investigation, one this story returns to later, before anyone seriously questioned that assumption. What made cholera so uniquely terrifying was simply its speed. A victim could appear in reasonable health at breakfast and be a corpse by nightfall, the body catastrophically dehydrated, skin taking on a bluish-gray tinge, eyes sinking visibly into the skull within hours. Survivors described watching neighbors, spouses, and children pass through this entire collapse in less time than it takes to properly cook and eat a meal, a speed that felt, to people living through it, closer to a curse than a disease. Terror this large curdled quickly into rumor. In several English towns during 1832, panicked crowds attacked doctors and cholera hospitals outright. Driven by a widespread belief that physicians were secretly poisoning the poor, or that hospital staff were harvesting body for dissection rather than treating the sick, fears made sharper by the recent Burke and Hare murders in Scotland, where killers had sold corpses to anatomists only a few years earlier. The so-called cholera riots of 1832 saw hospital windows smashed and staff physically attacked by people convinced the cure was more sinister than the disease. Fear of contagion also stripped away the customary rituals of death. Bodies were frequently buried within hours in mass graves. Without the wakes, viewings, or careful preparation families would ordinarily have insisted on, deepening the grief of survivors who felt their dead had been hurried into the ground like something shameful rather than mourned like someone loved. Entire streets sometimes lost multiple households within the same week, burying their dead in batches because there was neither time nor space to do otherwise. Medicine of the day had remarkably little to offer once symptoms appeared. Physicians prescribed calomel, a mercury compound that often worsened the very dehydration killing the patient, alongside bloodletting, opium, brandy, and camphor, treatments ranging from useless to actively dangerous. A patient's odds of survival, grimly, often had less to do with which doctor treated them than with how much fluid their body happened to retain before any treatment began. The disease struck the crowded, poorly drained slum neighborhoods from the previous chapter with visibly disproportionate force, and rather than prompting questions about contaminated water supplies, this pattern fed a considerably darker theory among some of the comfortable classes, that cholera was less a physical disease than a kind of divine judgment, a punishment visited specifically on the intemperate, irreligious habits of the poor. Blaming the dying for their own deaths required believing, conveniently, that the same clean water and decent housing already denied them would have made no difference anyway. By the time the epidemic finally burned itself out, it had killed something on the order of 32,000 people across Britain, concentrated overwhelmingly in exactly the industrial towns and packed urban slums this story has spent its previous chapters describing. The government's response, a hastily formed Central Board of Health, focused almost entirely on quarantine measures and street disinfection built around a theory of disease that was, as later chapters will make painfully clear, fundamentally wrong from the start. There is a small, almost unbearable irony buried inside this outbreak. A Scottish doctor named Thomas Latta, treating cholera patients during this very epidemic in 1832, tried something genuinely novel, injecting a saline solution directly into a dying patient's veins to replace the fluid the disease had drained away. Some of his patients who seemed beyond saving actually recovered. His method was, in essence, the correct treatment, discovered decades ahead of its time, and it was largely dismissed by the wider medical establishment and left to gather dust for the better part of a century. Ordinary daily commerce buckled under the fear as much as the disease itself. Markets emptied out as people avoided crowds entirely. Travelers from infected towns were turned away at the edges of villages that had so far escaped, and entire local economies stalled for weeks at a time. Not because cholera had definitely arrived, but because nobody could be certain it had not. A town's own uncertainty became, in its own quiet way, another kind of casualty. In one recorded case from a Manchester court during this epidemic, a single family lost 3 members within the space of 4 days, a mother and 2 children, while the father, spared only by chance, was left to arrange 3 burials in the time it might otherwise have taken to plan one. Multiply that single household by every court and cellar in every affected town, and the true weight of 32,000 deaths stops being a statistic and starts being simply unbearable to actually picture in full. This chapter ends deliberately without an answer because in 1832 there was not one to give. The killer moving through these streets had no face, no motive anyone could name, and no cure anyone could offer beyond vinegar, prayer, and hope. It would return again within the decade, and again after that, before a single stubborn doctor finally asked a question everyone else had somehow managed to avoid asking for more than 20 years. In 1832, a parliamentary committee chaired by the reformer Michael Sadler sat down in a room in Westminster and did something genuinely novel for the period. It asked mill workers, including children, to describe their own working lives directly, under oath in their own words, rather than relying on the polished assurances of the factory owners who employed them. One witness, a young woman named Elizabeth Bentley, testified that she had begun working in a flax mill at 6 years old, worked hours that regularly stretched past 12 a day, and had been beaten with a strap for the offense of falling behind at her machine. She told the committee her spine had grown visibly curved from years spent standing bent over her work, a deformity she would carry for the rest of her life as a permanent physical record of exactly when her childhood had ended. Testimony after testimony followed this same pattern, children describing being beaten awake at 2 or 3 in the morning for a shift, walking miles in darkness to reach the mill gate, and working stretches so long that some admitted to falling asleep standing upright at their machines, only to be struck awake again by an overseer determined not to lose a single minute of output to a tired child's exhaustion. All of this was transcribed, printed, and bound into the official parliamentary reports that workers and journalists of the period had already taken to calling blue books for the color of their covers, a term that would stay attached to official government reports for generations afterward. For the first time, a child's exhausted, matter-of-fact account of being struck awake at 2 in the morning existed not as street gossip, but as a permanent document sitting in the official record of the British government. Mill owners and their political allies pushed back immediately and forcefully, arguing the testimony had been selected, coached, and presented without any context that might have painted employers more sympathetically. Some of this criticism was not entirely without merit. Sadler was himself a political opponent of the rising industrial manufacturing class, aligned with older landed interests who had their own reasons, not purely humanitarian ones, for wanting to see factory owners embarrassed in public. That complicated motive does not actually undo what the testimony itself documented. Whatever mixture of genuine compassion and political convenience drove the men asking the questions, the answers given by Elizabeth Bentley and dozens like her were her own, spoken under oath, describing a childhood that had genuinely happened to her exactly as she described it. Impure motives among the questioners do not make an honest answer any less true. The immediate legislative result, the Factory Act of 1833, was considerably more modest than the horror of the testimony seemed to demand. It banned employing children under 9 in textile mills, limited the hours of older children, and, in its single most consequential provision, created the country's first ever paid factory inspectorate. For inspectors, in total, were given responsibility for checking conditions across every textile mill in the entire country. It is worth remembering, all the way back in the first chapter of this story, the flat statement that no inspector was coming to that mill floor in 1832 because the office that would eventually employ one did not yet exist. That office now exists. It is worth noticing, in the very next breath, that 4 men for the whole of industrial England amounts to roughly 1 inspector for every several hundred mills, which tells you a great deal about how seriously the promise was actually funded. Another witness, a teenage boy named Joseph Hebergam, described a body wrecked well beyond his years, legs bent and weakened from standing at machinery through adolescence, and a chronic cough he attributed directly to years of breathing cotton dust on the mill floor. He told the committee he did not expect to live to old age, and said it, by the account of those present, with a flat, unremarkable tone of someone stating an obvious fact rather than a tragedy, because within his own experience, it simply was one. The room itself, by the standards of the testimony being given inside it, was almost absurdly genteel, wood paneling, seated committee members in formal dress, clerks taking down every word in careful longhand, while a child described being strapped awake before dawn to keep pace with the machine. The contrast between the setting and the substance of what was being said inside it is, on its own, a fairly precise summary of exactly how far removed Westminster had been from the mill floor up to this point. When the report was finally published, it produced genuine public sensation, reprinted in pamphlets, discussed in newspapers, and illustrated in satirical cartoons that mocked mill owners as callous profiteers fattening themselves on the broken bodies of children. Public opinion, for the first time in this story, had something concrete to be outraged about, a bound document rather than a rumor. An outrage over a document is considerably harder for a government to simply wait out. It is fair to note the committee's methodology was hardly neutral. Sadler selected witnesses likely to support the case he had already decided to make, and critics at the time, not without justification, called the process closer to a prosecution than an impartial inquiry. History has generally judged the substance of the testimony as broadly credible regardless, corroborated by later, more rigorously conducted commissions covering the same ground. But the criticism is worth stating plainly, rather than pretending 1832 handed down some perfectly objective verdict. Sadler himself lost his parliamentary seat later that same year, a casualty of boundary changes following the 1832 Reform Act, rather than any backlash over the factory question. The cause he had championed did not die with his career, though. It passed to Lord Ashley, later known as the Earl of Shaftesbury, a committed evangelical reformer who would spend the next several decades of his life dragging factory and mine legislation through Parliament. One incremental, hard-fought act at a time, well beyond anything this single chapter has room to cover. What makes this chapter the genuine hinge of the whole story is not the modesty of that legislative result. It is the fact that something irreversible had happened regardless. A government record now existed, in a child's own words, describing exactly what the previous 9 chapters have shown you happening on mill floors and coal pits and cellar rooms across the country. Owners could still lobby against reform, still minimize it, still delay it for years. What none of them could credibly do any longer was claim they simply had not known. A husband and wife married more than 40 years arrived together at a workhouse gate, having finally exhausted every other option available to them. And within minutes of admission, they are stripped of their own clothing, issued a uniform, and marched through separate doors into separate wings of the same building. Under the law now governing this institution, they may not share a room, a meal, or so much as a conversation again for as long as they both remain inside it. Poor relief in England had, for centuries before this, generally meant what historians now call outdoor relief. Small payments or supplies of food delivered to struggling families in their own homes, administered parish by parish under a system dating back to Elizabethan law. The New Poor Law of 1834 tore this arrangement up almost entirely, replacing it with a single national policy that pushed the able-bodied poor toward one option only: enter the workhouse or receive nothing at all. The philosophy behind the new system had a name its own architects used openly: less eligibility. Life inside a workhouse had to be made deliberately worse than the meanest paid job available outside it, on the theory that only genuine, desperate need would drive anyone to accept such conditions voluntarily. Poverty, in this framework, was treated less as a misfortune to relieve than as a moral failing to be discouraged through calculated discomfort. Separating families by sex and age was not an unfortunate side effect of overcrowding. It was explicit, stated policy, justified by officials partly as a matter of enforcing discipline and partly, in genuinely uncomfortable language recorded at the time, as a way of discouraging paupers from having more children they could not support. Married elderly couples, adult siblings, parents, and older children all fell under rules that prioritized administrative order over any recognition that a family might actually want to stay together. Daily life inside followed a rigid, monotonous schedule built around uniforms, silence, and deliberately unpleasant labor. Men frequently picked oakum, unraveling old tarred rope fiber by fiber until their fingers cracked and bled, or broke stones into gravel for hours on end. Meals were plain to the point of punishment, a thin gruel appearing so consistently in workhouse diets of the period that it became, within a few years, a kind of national shorthand for institutional cruelty itself. Charles Dickens gave that shorthand its most enduring image in 1837, publishing Oliver Twist as a direct, furious response to exactly this system. And the scene of a starving child asking for a second helping of gruel became so widely recognized that it shaped public understanding of the new poor law for generations afterward, arguably more effectively than any government report managed to. Fiction, in this particular case, did work that official statistics alone had struggled to accomplish. The shame attached to entering a workhouse ran so deep that many families endured genuine starvation outside its walls rather than accept what admission required of them. And officials at the time frequently celebrated falling numbers of applicants as evidence the policy was successfully discouraging dependency. It rarely seems to have occurred to them that fewer people asking for help might simply mean more people quietly suffering in silence just outside the gate, unwilling to pay the price of admission. The system's own logic produced a genuine scandal at Andover Workhouse in the mid-1840s, when an official inquiry found starving inmates gnawing on scraps of rotting bone marrow from bones they had been assigned to crush in a fertilizer as their daily labor. The resulting public inquiry embarrassed the Poor Law Commission badly enough to force real administrative changes, though the underlying philosophy of less eligibility survived the scandal almost entirely intact. Opposition to the new poor law was neither quiet nor purely theoretical. Riots broke out across parts of northern England in 1837 and 1838, with crowds attacking newly built workhouses and the officials sent to enforce the law, in scenes that echoed the same anger already documented in this story's chapters on machine breaking in Peterloo. The specific target had changed. The underlying fury of being managed, disciplined, and punished by a system built without its subjects' consent had not. The scale of this new system was substantial by design. Parishes across the country were grouped into so-called poor law unions, and more than 600 new union workhouses were built or repurposed within a decade of the 1834 Act, a genuinely enormous nationwide construction program undertaken specifically to house the poor under conditions harsh enough to discourage them from staying. Many of these buildings were designed with radial or cruciform layouts, wings branching outward from a central point where a master or matron could observe multiple yards and corridors at once, an arrangement drawing directly on ideas about constant institutional surveillance that had been circulating among reformers for decades. The architecture itself was built to watch its own inhabitants, which tells you something about what kind of institution its designers believed they were actually running. Admission stripped away more than clothing and company. Names were recorded and replaced, for practical purposes, with numbers and ward assignments. Personal belongings were confiscated and stored until departure, and every inmate was issued a uniform stamped clearly enough that anyone glancing at them on the street could immediately identify their status as a pauper. It was not merely relief. It was a visible, wearable demotion in social standing, applied the moment a person walked through the gate. Children born or orphaned inside these institutions frequently ended up funneled into precisely the pauper apprenticeship system described several chapters earlier, bound out to distant mills as unpaid labor in exchange for their food and a bed. The workhouse and the mill, in other words, were never two separate stories running in parallel. They were two ends of a single conveyor belt, and a great many children who began at one end of it were guaranteed to end up at the other. It is worth sitting, finally, with who actually designed this system. Educated, comfortable men, drafting policy in London committee rooms, applying economic theories about incentives and deterrence to a population whose hunger, cold, and desperation none of them had ever personally experienced for even a single day. They built a machine for managing poverty with the same cold, untested confidence a mill owner brought to a spinning frame, and the people fed into it had, once again, essentially no say in the design. A leather harness is buckled around a 6-year-old girl's waist, a chain running back between her legs to a loaded coal cart called a corve, and she is sent forward on hands and knees through a tunnel barely 2 feet high, dragging the load behind her the way a person might otherwise use an animal. This was not an unusual arrangement in British coal mines before 1842. It was simply called hurrying, and it was one of the most common jobs a child in a mining family could expect to hold. A second job, if anything, was worse in its own quiet way. Trappers, often no older than 4 or 5, were stationed alone beside small ventilation doors deep in the pit, tasked with opening the door the instant they heard a coal cart approaching and closing it again the moment it passed, in order to control the mine's airflow. They sat in absolute darkness for shifts lasting up to 12 hours, often without so much as a candle, because a child sitting still in the dark needed no light by the mine owner's arithmetic, and because open flames near pockets of gas carry their own separate danger. That gas was a constant, silent threat running underneath every hour spent in these pits. Fire damp, largely methane, could ignite from a single spark and tear through a tunnel network in a wall of flame. Choke damp, an oxygen-starved mixture of gases, could kill just as effectively without any explosion at all, simply by replacing breathable air with something that offered a miner nothing to draw into his lungs. Neither hazard cared how young the person breathing that air happened to be. In 1842, following years of mounting pressure led by reformers including Lord Ashley, a royal commission published its findings on child labor specifically inside British mines, and the report included detailed illustrations depicting exactly what has just been described: harnessed children crawling on all fours through cramped tunnels, drawn with a clinical precision that left considerably less room for polite disbelief than written testimony alone had managed a decade earlier in the mills. Public shock at these images was genuine, though it is worth being honest about what exactly shocked Victorian society the most. Alongside real horror at child exploitation sat a separate, distinctly Victorian discomfort. The report also documented women and girls working half-dressed in the underground heat alongside men, and a considerable share of the resulting outrage centered as much on perceived indecency as on the children's actual suffering. Reform, once again, arrived carried on a mixture of genuine compassion and rather less flattering social anxiety. Testimony collected for the commission included accounts from women who continued hurrying coal well into pregnancy, describing chains cutting into skin already raw from the harness, crawling on hands and knees through tunnels too low to stand in until shortly before giving birth, then returning to the same work again within days or weeks afterward because a family's income could not survive a longer absence. These were not exceptional hardship cases held up for shock value. Commissioners recorded them as broadly representative of ordinary practice across the coal fields. The Mines Act of 1842 followed quickly, banning all women and girls from working underground entirely and setting a minimum age of 10 for boys entering the pits. It stands as a genuine, hard-won victory, arriving only after decades in which the same conditions had already been observed, described, and largely ignored by anyone with the power to act on them. One piece of testimony from the 1842 Commission has survived more vividly than almost any other document in this entire story. A 17-year-old hurrier named Patience Kershaw told commissioners she worked in complete darkness for much of her shift, but the harness left her badly bruised, and that she would rather work in a mine than face the indoor alternatives available to a girl of her station, a statement less an endorsement of the pit than a flat description of just how limited her actual choices were. Her words were quoted so widely afterward that she became, without ever intending to, one of the defining voices of this entire chapter of British history. Enforcement of the New Mines Act, predictably by this point in the story, lagged well behind the law itself. No dedicated corps of mine inspectors existed yet to actually check compliance underground, and some owners simply falsified children's ages on the payroll, a loophole made easy by the fact that poor families often had no formal birth certificate to contradict whatever number an employer chose to write down. A law with no one checking its enforcement is, once again, only ever as strong as the honesty of the very people it was written to restrain. The victory carried an uncomfortable complication that reformers rarely liked to dwell on afterward. Many mining families depended directly on a wife's or daughter's underground wage to make ends meet, and the sudden loss of that income pushed a number of these same households into sharper poverty in the short term, even as the law protecting them was, by any humane measure, correct to exist. Doing the right thing and doing the financially survivable thing were not, for a great many families in these coal fields, automatically the same decision. In a dim, poorly ventilated workshop, a young woman leans over her workbench and a coworker notices something in the dark corner of the room that should not be possible. The swollen side of her jaw is giving off a faint, sickly green glow. This is not a symptom from a horror story. It is a documented feature of phosphorus necrosis, later shortened on the factory floor to a name far more casual than the disease deserved: phossy jaw. Friction matches using white phosphorus became widely available from the 1830s onward, replacing clumsy flint and tinder as the easiest way to strike flame, and demand among ordinary households was enormous. Factories producing them sprang up to meet that demand, staffed overwhelmingly by young women and girls, some barely into their teens, dipping match splints into a phosphorus paste for shifts stretching 12 to 14 hours at a time inside rooms, with little to no ventilation for the fumes that paste constantly released into the air. Workers frequently ate their meals at the very same benches where they had been dipping matches all day, because separate eating facilities were rarely provided, which meant phosphorus residue on unwashed hands passed directly into food, and from there, into the body through a route far more effective than the fumes alone. A bad tooth, common enough among poor Victorian workers to begin with, gave the phosphorus a direct opening into the jawbone itself. What followed, once phosphorus took hold in the bone, was a slow horror. Toothache and swelling progressed to abscesses that would not heal, then to visible decay of the jawbone itself, sometimes bright enough with trapped phosphorescence to glow faintly in a darkened room, exactly as witnesses described. In severe cases, surgeons removed the entire diseased jawbone in an attempt to save the patient's life, and even then the underlying phosphorus poisoning could still prove fatal by damaging the liver and other organs long after the jaw itself was gone. Employers, faced with a rising number of disfigured and dying former employees, largely responded by denying any connection between the disease and the workplace at all, some suggesting poor personal dental hygiene was the real culprit rather than the phosphorus their own factories filled the air with every single day. Workers who developed early symptoms were frequently dismissed outright, a policy that had the additional convenient effect of removing the visible evidence from the factory floor before it could alarm anyone else still healthy enough to keep working. The genuinely damning detail is that none of this was medically mysterious by the time it was happening in Britain. Doctors on the European continent had already identified and described phosphorus necrosis as an occupational disease as early as the 1830s in several countries, including Finland, Denmark, France, and eventually Germany, moved to restrict or ban white phosphorus in match production years, in some cases decades, before British manufacturers faced any comparable pressure to do the same. A genuinely safer alternative existed for most of this period as well. Safety matches using red phosphorus, non-toxic and considerably less prone to accidental ignition, were patented in Sweden in the 1840s and refined by the Lundstrom brothers into a commercially viable product not long after. British manufacturers were broadly aware of this alternative and largely declined to switch, since red phosphorus matches cost more to produce, and white phosphorus versions continued selling perfectly well to a public that had no way of knowing what the difference actually cost the women dipping them. Workers in these factories often carried a distinctive, garlicky smell on their breath, a recognized symptom of phosphorus exposure that anyone living near a match works eventually learned to notice and neighbor. It became, in its own grim way, an identifying mark of the trade, much like the calloused knees of a climbing boy or the curved spine of a mill girl. Every industry in this story, it seems, eventually wrote its cost directly onto the bodies of the people performing it. Word of the disease traveled through match-working communities long before any government report confirmed it officially, and families sending daughters into these factories anyway were rarely acting out of ignorance. They were acting, as families throughout this story consistently have, out of a poverty severe enough that a wage today mattered more than a disfigurement that might, or might not, arrive years down the line. Risk calculated against hunger is not really a choice in any meaningful sense of a word. One of the largest and most prominent match manufacturers of this era was Bryant and May, based at a large factory in Bow, in the East End of London, a firm respected enough in polite society to associate itself publicly with charitable causes and civic respectability. That same firm's own workshops are where a great deal of the Fossey Jaw testimony this chapter draws on actually took place, a contradiction between public image and factory floor reality that this story will return to directly, and rather more dramatically, later on. For the women who survived Fossey Jaw with visible disfigurement, the disease rarely ended at the hospital door. A collapsed jaw could make eating, speaking, and simply being seen in public permanently difficult, and prospective employers in an era obsessed with respectable appearance were frequently unwilling to hire a young woman carrying such an obvious mark of her former trade. The factory took her health, and then, indirectly, made it harder for her to ever fully replace the wage it had also taken. So hold both facts in your head at once as this chapter closes. A safer method existed. Other countries had already proven it worked and acted on that proof. British match manufacturers had every piece of information required to protect their own workers, and for decades, the calculations simply never tipped in the workers' favor, because the women being poisoned had no seat at the table where that calculation was actually being made. A handloom weaver sits at his kitchen table doing arithmetic that refuses to come out right no matter how many times he runs the numbers. Even if his wife and children work every waking hour alongside him, the total will still fall short of what a loaf of bread cost this month, and it has fallen short for longer than he cares to admit out loud. This particular kind of hunger was not a crisis confined to one bad harvest. For an enormous number of working families across the 1830s and 1840s, it was simply the ongoing condition of being alive. Handloom weavers make a particularly stark example of what mechanization actually cost the people it displaced. A trade that had paid a genuinely comfortable wage at the start of the century saw its earnings collapse by well over half within a few decades, crushed by competition from power looms that a single unskilled operator could run at a fraction of the cost. Weavers kept working the same long hours at the same craft their fathers had been proud of, for wages that had, in real terms, been quietly cut out from under them. Making that hunger considerably worse was a set of laws with no ambiguity about whose interests they served. The Corn Laws, in place from 1815, imposed steep tariffs on imported grains specifically to keep domestic prices high, protecting the income of landowning families who sat, not coincidentally, in the same parliament that had passed the tariffs in the first place. Bread, the single most essential food for the poorest households in the country, was kept artificially expensive by law for the direct financial benefit of people who never missed a meal in their lives. Even food that families could afford was frequently not quite what it appeared to be. The chemist Frederick Acum published a landmark exposure in 1820 documenting widespread adulteration of common foodstuffs, alum mixed into bread to whiten cheap flour, chalk and even plaster stirred into milk to stretch its volume, sand added to sugar, and used tea leaves recolored with toxic dyes and resold as fresh. Poisoning yourself slowly was, for a great many poor households, simply an unavoidable risk of eating it all. Acum's reward for this work was not gratitude. Tradesmen implicated by his findings turned on him with such hostility, including a dubious accusation of vandalizing a library he had been researching in, that he eventually left England altogether for a post in Germany. It is a small, telling pattern by this point in the story. The people who exposed the harm being done to the poor very often paid a real personal cost for the exposure, while the harm itself simply continued. The 1840s earned the grim nickname the Hungry 40s for good reason. Poor harvests, a severe economic depression, and mass unemployment converged at once, filling soup kitchens and swelling the very workhouses described earlier in this story well beyond anything their designers had planned capacity for. Meanwhile, across the Irish Sea, a catastrophic famine beginning in 1845 was starving a nation and driving a wave of desperate migration directly into the same overcrowded English industrial cities already struggling to house and feed the people already living there. Pressure to repeal the Corn Laws built through an organized campaign called the Anti-Corn Law League, founded in Manchester in 1838 and led by Richard Cobden and John Bright, both of them, tellingly, mill owners and manufacturers rather than selfless champions of the poor. Cheaper bread meant workers could survive on lower wages, which suited an industrialist ledger just as neatly as it suited a starving family's dinner table. Reform, once again, found its most effective champions among people who stood to profit from it directly, alongside those who simply needed to eat. For most working households of this period, food was not one expense among several. It regularly consumed somewhere between 60 and 80% of an entire family's income, leaving whatever thin margin remained to cover rent, fuel, and clothing combined. A single bad week, a lost job, a sick breadwinner could tip a family from merely struggling into outright starvation almost overnight, because there was simply no financial cushion built into the arithmetic anywhere. The danger of adulterated food was not always slow or invisible. In 1858, in Bradford, a batch of peppermint sweets was accidentally made using arsenic trioxide in place of a cheaper, harmless filler a dishonest supplier had substituted to cut costs, and the mistake killed more than 20 people, many of them children, while sickening several hundred more within days. It stands as one of the clearest, most horrifying illustrations of exactly what an unregulated food supply could do when cost-cutting and simple greed intersected with a product nobody thought to test. Charitable soup kitchens sprang up across industrial towns during the worst years of the Hungry 40s, run by churches and local benefactors doling out thin broth to lines of people stretching down entire streets. It offered genuine, immediate relief to people with nowhere else to turn. And it also functioned as a fairly visible public reminder of exactly how many working, willing adults a supposedly prosperous industrial economy had somehow still managed to leave unable to feed themselves. The Corn Laws were finally repealed in 1846, pushed through Parliament by the Conservative Prime Minister Robert Peel against the furious objections of his own party's landed base, a decision made urgent by the horror unfolding in Ireland and one that split his party for a generation afterward. Bread prices did fall in the years that followed. It did nothing, however, to bring back the handloom weaver's trade or restore the wages of any craft machinery had already made obsolete. Cheaper food could not undo the damage this story's earlier chapters had already done to how that food got paid for. Cholera returned to Britain in 1849 and again in 1854, and each time it arrived, doctors were still reaching for the same explanation offered back in this story's 9th chapter. That foul air itself carried the disease. One physician, a careful, methodical anesthesiologist named John Snow, had already begun quietly doubting that explanation years earlier, based on nothing more dramatic than paying close attention to exactly who was getting sick and exactly where. In late August 1854, an outbreak erupted in Soho, London, with a speed and concentration that dwarfed almost anything described earlier in this story. More than 500 people died within roughly 10 days, in an area covering only a few crowded streets. A death toll so densely packed into so small a space that panicked residents fled the neighborhood entirely, convinced the very air of Soho had turned lethal overnight. Snow did something almost nobody in authority had thought to do with any rigor. He walked the neighborhood himself, going door to door, asking grieving families exactly when their relatives had fallen ill and, crucially, where they had gotten their drinking water. He marked every single death on a hand-drawn map of the streets, and as the marks accumulated, a pattern emerged that no theory about bad air could easily explain. The deaths clustered tightly, almost obsessively, around one single water pump on Broad Street. Two anomalies in his data made the picture even sharper. Workers at a nearby brewery, who drank mostly beer brewed on site rather than the neighborhood's water, had scarcely been touched by the outbreak at all. Meanwhile, a woman living well outside Soho had also died of cholera, and Snow discovered she simply preferred the taste of Broad Street's water so much that she had it delivered to her home daily. Both details, on their own, might mean nothing. Together, they pointed at exactly one shared cause. Armed with his map, Snow approached the local council and persuaded them, against no small amount of institutional skepticism, to simply remove the handle from the Broad Street pump, making it impossible for anyone to draw water from it. New cases in the immediate area fell off sharply afterward, though the outbreak, in fairness, was likely already burning itself out by that point regardless. The gesture mattered less for its immediate medical effect than for what it represented. Someone had finally acted on a theory of contaminated water instead of foul air. A local clergyman named Henry Whitehead, initially skeptical of Snow's water theory and determined to disprove it through his own independent inquiry among his parishioners, ended up doing something even more valuable than confirming it. Digging deeper into the case history of the very first victims, he and Snow together traced the outbreak's true origin to a single infant in a house near the pump, whose soiled diapers had been washed into a cesspool that, investigators discovered, was leaking directly into the well supplying Broad Street's water. A skeptic's honest search for a flaw in the theory ended up supplying its final damning proof. None of this settled the argument as quickly or as cleanly as it perhaps should have. The General Board of Health and a number of prominent physicians remained committed to miasma theory for years afterward, and Snow's own findings received a fairly muted reception during what remained of his lifetime. He died in 1858, several years before germ theory, developed further by researchers on the European continent, finally supplied the missing mechanism that made his waterborne theory impossible to dismiss any longer. What finally moved Parliament to act at real scale, tellingly, was not Snow's careful map or Whitehead's patient detective work. It was the summer of 1858, when a heat wave baked untreated sewage sitting in the Thames until the stench became so overwhelming that it reached directly into the Houses of Parliament itself, forcing members to consider hanging curtains soaked in chloride of lime over the windows just to keep working. The event earned its own nickname at the time, the Great Stink, and it did more to secure funding for a real sewer system in a single summer than years of evidence about dying slum families had managed to achieve. The engineer Joseph Bazalgette was given the resulting mandate and built a sewer network stretching well over 1,000 miles beneath London, one of the largest civil engineering projects the city had ever attempted, completed through the 1860s and 1870s. London's last major cholera outbreak came in 1866, concentrated almost entirely in the one district not yet connected to Bazalgette's new system, a final, near-perfect piece of confirming evidence for a theory the establishment had spent more than a decade resisting. So this chapter closes the mystery opened back in the 9th, but it closes it on a genuinely bitter note. The killer finally had a name, and a mechanism, and a fix. It simply took more than 2 decades, tens of thousands of additional deaths, and one unbearably foul-smelling summer in the halls of Parliament itself, before the people with the power to act actually felt the problem land on their own doorstep. At about 5 in the evening on January 10th, 1860, in Lawrence, Massachusetts, a 5-story textile mill packed with roughly 900 workers simply gave way, all at once, folding straight down into a mountain of brick, timber, and iron machinery in under a minute. A witness standing nearby said afterward that the building looked as though it had simply sunk into the earth. Inside that collapsing structure were mostly young women and girls, many of them recent immigrants, finishing what should have been an ordinary day's work. Lawrence itself had been built only a couple of decades earlier as a deliberately planned industrial city, financed by investors explicitly hoping to build an American answer to Manchester, and it drew exactly the same kind of workforce this story has already spent chapters describing across the Atlantic. Young women following the established New England pattern of mill work, alongside a growing population of Irish and French Canadian immigrants filling out the factory floors as the city expanded. The Pemberton Mill had been constructed in 1853 using cast iron support pillars that were thinner and of noticeably poorer quality, and the structure genuinely required a cost-cutting decision made during construction that nobody was ever forced to correct. Later ownership compounded the danger further, packing the upper floors with substantially more heavy machinery than the building's original design had ever accounted for, adding weight and vibration onto pillars that had been inadequate even before a single extra machine arrived. Some workers had reportedly noticed unusual vibrations and strange creaking sounds in the building during the weeks before the collapse. Small warning signs of exactly the kind this story has already shown you being noticed, mentioned, and then quietly set aside in mill after mill, mine after mine, chapter after chapter. No inspection system existed in Massachusetts at this point capable of forcing anyone to act on a rumor of creaking iron, and so nobody did, until the iron itself finally stopped holding. Townspeople converged on the wreckage within minutes of the collapse, and an enormous, largely improvised rescue effort continued through the freezing January night, working by lantern light with bare hands, crowbars, and simple tools to pull the living and the dead out from beneath collapsed floors and twisted machinery. Cries for help could reportedly be heard rising from deep inside the wreckage for hours, guiding rescuers toward survivors who were, in many cases, still trapped too tightly to be reached quickly. Then, hours into the rescue, disaster compounded itself. A lantern being used to light the search was knocked over somewhere deep in the debris, and the resulting fire caught quickly among broken timber, spilled oil, and machinery, spreading through the wreckage while survivors were still pinned beneath it. Rescuers and family members who had been digging desperately only minutes earlier were forced backward by the flames, forced to listen as the fire reached people they had just been trying, with their bare hands, to save. There is no way to soften what happened next, and this documentary is not going to try. An unknown number of the survivors still trapped in that wreckage burned to death in front of a crowd that had spent hours trying to save them, close enough to hear their voices and unable to reach them before the fire did. It remains one of the more genuinely unbearable images in the entire history of American industry, precisely because it did not have to happen at all. Estimates of the final death toll from that single evening range up to around 145 people, with several hundred more injured, making it one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history up to that point. Lawrence, a city built only a few years earlier as a hopeful showcase of industrial planning, spent the following days digging graves instead. A coroner's investigation afterward concluded plainly that defective cast iron pillars, combined with the building's overloading well beyond its intended capacity, had caused the collapse, laying the blame squarely on decisions made by builders and owners chasing lower costs and higher output. And in a pattern the story's viewers should by now find grimly familiar, no one was ever criminally punished for any of it. The dead were mourned, the report was filed, and the mill was eventually rebuilt on the very same ground. Survivors pulled from the wreckage that night described the collapse itself as almost instantaneous. A lurch, a deafening crack of iron giving way, and then floor after floor coming down on top of the one below it in the space of a few seconds, machinery, brick, and bodies compacting together into a single ruined mass. There was no warning bell, no chance to run for a door. One moment the floor was solid beneath 900 pairs of feet, and the next it simply was not. American newspapers covered the disaster with an intensity that reached well beyond Massachusetts, running detailed, often graphic accounts of the wreckage and the fire that horrified readers across the country and put industrial building safety in front of the public in a way no earlier accident quite had. Pemberton would stand for decades as one of the deadliest factory disasters in American history, a grim distinction it held until an even more infamous fire took hold of a New York garment factory more than 50 years later, a tragedy this story's final chapters will eventually circle back toward. The public horror did produce some lasting effect. Massachusetts moved in the years that followed to establish one of the earliest state factory inspection systems in the United States, driven in no small part by the memory of Pemberton and the plain, undeniable fact that no inspector had ever once checked those cast iron pillars before 900 people walked in to stand beneath them. It was in its own limited way this country's own version of the Sadler Papers, a disaster loud enough that ignorance stopped being a credible excuse. The mill itself was rebuilt on the same ground within a couple of years, with sturdier pillars this time, and resumed production not long after the graves of its previous workforce had properly settled. Industrial capital, this story has shown you again and again, tends to recover from tragedy considerably faster than the families standing at those gravesides ever do. What Pemberton ultimately proves, sitting where it does in this story, is that everything you have watched happen across an ocean and several decades in England was never a peculiarly English failure of character. Give any industrializing country the same incentives, the same absence of inspection, and the same willingness to treat a cheaper support pillar as an acceptable risk, and you get the same outcome, regardless of which side of the Atlantic the mill happens to be standing on. On the afternoon of January 16, 1862, at the Hartley colliery in Northumberland, a massive cast iron beam belonging to the pit's pumping engine cracked without warning and fell directly down the mine's single shaft, dragging tons of broken machinery and debris with it. In an instant, the only way in or out of the pit was completely sealed, and 204 men and boys working below were trapped with no second route to the surface. This particular horror was built directly into the mine's design. Hartley Colliery had only one shaft, internally divided by a wooden partition into two separate airways, one carrying men and coal down, the other carrying stale air back up. It functioned, in ordinary operation, well enough. It also meant that if anything ever blocked that single shaft, there was no second, independent way for either people or fresh air to reach the men working hundreds of feet below. A handful of men working closest to the surface were killed instantly or shortly afterward by the falling debris itself. The overwhelming majority of the workforce below, though, survived that initial moment entirely uninjured, which makes what followed considerably more agonizing to sit with. These men and boys did not die in the accident. They were left alive, sealed underground, with a finite and steadily worsening supply of breathable air and absolutely no way to reach the surface on their own. Rescue teams began digging immediately, joined within hours by volunteer miners from neighboring collieries who understood exactly what was at stake and worked in continuous shifts to clear the enormous mass of broken iron and rock choking the shaft. Further rock falls repeatedly threatened the rescuers themselves as they worked, and the sheer physical scale of the debris made progress agonizingly slow, measured in mere feet cleared per exhausting hour. Above ground, an enormous crowd gathered at the pit head and simply did not leave, wives, mothers, and children standing through 6 freezing January days and nights, watching the rescue effort inch forward, clinging to whatever fragments of hope the diggers could offer them. It is one of the earliest, well-documented instances of a scene that would repeat itself at mining disasters for the next century and beyond, an entire community standing at a hole in the ground, waiting for news it could not control and could not hurry. When rescuers finally broke through after 6 days, they found every single one of the 204 men and boys below dead, killed not by the falling beam, but by suffocation, as the trapped, unventilated air slowly filled with poisonous gas and ran out of oxygen entirely. Evidence at the scene suggested many of the miners had lived for a day or more after the collapse, gathering together and building makeshift barriers in an attempt to wall themselves into whatever pocket of breathable air remained the longest. Among the dead were boys as young as 10 years old, precisely the minimum age the Mines Act of 1842, described several chapters ago in this story, had established as the threshold for legal work underground. That law had genuinely mattered. It had kept 6- and 7-year-olds like the hurriers and trappers of an earlier chapter out of exactly this danger. It made no difference whatsoever, however, to a shaft with only one way out, because that particular danger had never been the one anyone had gotten around to legislating against yet. The scale of the loss shocked the entire country, dominating newspaper coverage for weeks and prompting one of the largest public charitable subscriptions raised for any industrial disaster up to that time, providing crucial support for the widows and orphans that a single afternoon in January had suddenly created by the hundreds. Queen Victoria herself, still in mourning for her own late husband at the time, sent a message of condolence to the bereaved families of Hartley. Parliament responded with unusual speed by the standards this story has otherwise documented, passing the Coal Mines Regulation Act later in 1862, which required every colliery in the country to maintain at least 2 separate, independent shafts, so that no single point of failure could ever again seal an entire underground workforce inside its own grave. It stands as one of the clearest, most direct causal lines in this whole story, a specific mechanical flaw, identified in blood, corrected in law within the same calendar year. There's a quiet, almost eerie symmetry worth pointing out between this disaster and the one just before it. Pemberton's pillars and Hartley's beam were both made of cast iron, the celebrated miracle material of the entire industrial age, strong, cheap, and endlessly moldable into exactly the shapes an engineer wanted. What nobody could reliably detect at the time was a hidden casting flaw buried invisibly inside the metal itself, a hairline weakness that gave no warning right up until the moment the load finally exceeded it. The same wonder material killed people on both sides of the Atlantic in the same 2 years, for essentially the identical hidden reason. The volunteer miners who descended into a mine everyone already knew was slowly filling with poison gas deserved their own moment of recognition here. Men who understood exactly what killed the people they were digging toward and chose to go down into that same danger anyway, in continuous relays for 6 straight days. Their names rarely made it into the newspapers that covered the disaster itself. Their labor is the entire reason anyone was ever recovered at all. The village of Hartley itself never fully recovered its previous shape. A community this small, losing 204 men and boys in a single afternoon, meant that in a great many houses along the same street, every adult male was simply gone at once, leaving behind widows, orphan children, and a local economy with no one left to work the very pit that had just killed everyone else who once did. A memorial was raised afterward, and it still stands today, though no monument was ever going to be adequate to what that one street actually lost. Set this chapter next to the one before it, and notice what actually separates them, because it is not the death toll or the negligence, both of which run distressingly similar in each case. It is the shape of the dying itself. Pemberton's workers died in roughly a minute, violently, with no time to understand what was happening to them. Hartley's miners had a day, or more, to understand exactly what was happening, to gather together in the dark, and to wait for an ending they could do absolutely nothing to prevent. It is difficult to say, honestly, which fate is the crueler one to have lived through. Ask a farm laborer in 1760 what time it is, and he will likely glance at the sun, shrug, and tell you it is somewhere around midday, close enough for whatever he needs to do next. Ask someone living in an English mill town a century later the exact same question, and their entire body will answer with a number, learned so deeply it no longer feels like knowledge at all. It simply feels like instinct, that shift, quiet, gradual, and almost entirely undiscussed at the time it was happening, may be the single most permanent thing this story has described. It took more than a century after the fact for anyone to properly name what had happened. The historian E.P. Thompson, writing in 1967, described this transformation as the rise of time discipline. the process by which task-oriented labor, working until the harvest was in or the herd was fed, was replaced by a wholly different relationship in which time itself became the unit being measured, managed, and enforced. Thompson was not describing ancient history when he wrote this. He was naming a change so total that, by his own century, almost nobody could remember life organized any other way. Pre-industrial time had its own vocabulary, and that vocabulary tells you everything about how differently it was experienced. A task might be measured as the time it takes to milk a cow, or to say a particular prayer, or to smoke a pipe down to its ash. None of these units divided evenly into hours, because none of them were meant to. Time moved at the speed of the work itself, rather than the work being forced to move at the speed of a fixed external unit that had nothing to do with the task in front of you. The factory floor inverted that relationship entirely, and it did so specifically by turning time into something that could be bought and sold like any other commodity. A wage calculated by the hour makes an hour, for the first time in most workers' lived experience, into a unit with a literal price attached. Arrive 5 minutes late, and you have not merely inconvenienced anyone. You have failed to deliver goods you had implicitly promised to sell, and the deduction from your pay packet reflects exactly that, priced out to the minute. There's a bitter little irony buried in how personal time-keeping actually spread through the working class during this period. Owning a pocket watch became increasingly common among ordinary workers across the 19th century, not primarily as a luxury or a status symbol, but as a practical necessity, a tool workers needed to buy with their own wages simply to avoid being fined for a lateness the factory clock alone would otherwise judge them guilty of. The instrument of a person's own discipline became, quite literally, something they were expected to purchase themselves. The railways pushed this transformation to its logical, nationwide extreme. Before the rail network, every English town kept its own local time based on the sun directly overhead, meaning noon in Bristol and noon in London might differ by several minutes. A discrepancy nobody particularly minded when travel between them took the better part of a day regardless. Trains needed to run on a single shared timetable to avoid colliding with each other, and by the 1880s Britain had adopted one standardized clock, Greenwich Mean Time, across the entire country, erasing centuries of local solar time in favor of a single synchronized national instant. Karl Marx, living and writing in England during much of this same period, drew directly on the factory inspector's own reports, many of them describing exactly the mills, the hours, and the child labor this documentary has already walked you through, to build his argument that industrial labor alienated workers from the goods they produced and from time itself, transforming their own hours into something owned and disposed of by someone else entirely. Whatever you make of his broader politics, that specific observation was drawn directly from the same paper trail this story has been following since Chapter 10. This rewiring was not merely social or economic. Modern chronobiology, the study of the body's internal clocks, has repeatedly found that disrupted, non-natural sleep and work schedules carry measurable long-term health costs, and the World Health Organization has classified overnight shift work as a probable carcinogen, based specifically on the toll irregular, clock-imposed schedules take on the human body's biological rhythms. The great-grandchildren of the workers described in this film's first chapter are, in a very real, documented sense, still paying a biological cost for an arrangement none of them personally agreed to. Here, finally, is the dark, quiet center this whole story has been circling since its third chapter. You can dismantle a mill. You can shut down a mine, ban a chemical, rebuild a sewer system, and pass a law requiring 2 shafts instead of 1. Every single fix this documentary has shown you addressed a specific, nameable danger, and every single one of them, however incomplete, was at least theoretically reversible. What almost none of them touched was the deeper transformation underneath all of it, the conversion of a human life into hours that could be measured, sold, and taken away. That change was never legislated. It simply happened, and it has never once been legislated back. In June 1888, a group of teenage girls and young women working at the Bryant and May Match factory in Bow decided that being fired was a smaller risk than continuing to quietly endure what the work was doing to their bodies, and what its owners kept insisting, decades after doctors had proven otherwise, had nothing whatsoever to do with the phosphorus they handled all day. The spark came from outside the factory gates first. The social reformer and journalist Annie Besant published an article that same month titled White Slavery in London, built directly on interviews with the workers themselves, laying out in plain, damning detail the starvation wages, punitive fine system, and the ever-present danger of phosphorus necrosis that Bryant and May's respectable public image had spent years quietly papering over. Management's response managed to make things considerably worse for themselves. Company officials pressured workers to sign a statement denying Besant's account, and when one worker was suspected of having spoken to her, that worker was dismissed outright. Rather than silencing the workforce, the firing lit the exact fuse it was meant to smother, and roughly 1,400 women and girls walked out of the factory within days, in one of the largest strikes by female workers Britain had yet seen. Besant and a small circle of supporters helped the strikers organize a strike fund and press their case publicly, and the dispute drew a level of sympathetic newspaper coverage that would have been almost unimaginable for a labor action involving unskilled women only a decade or two earlier. Public opinion, primed by years of prior reporting on Fossey Jaw, proved unusually receptive to believing these particular workers rather than their employer. Within roughly 3 weeks, Bryant and May capitulated to nearly every demand the strikers had raised. The dismissed worker was reinstated, the unfair system of wage deductions was abolished, and, most directly relevant to the specific horror described several chapters earlier, the company agreed to provide a separate room for workers to eat their meals away from the phosphorus-laden work floor, directly addressing one of the clearest routes by which the poison had been entering their bodies in the first place. Out of the strike came the Union of Women Matchmakers, one of the largest and most significant unions of female workers Britain had produced up to that point, a genuinely new kind of organization built and led by exactly the unskilled young women that existing trade unions had traditionally overlooked or excluded outright. Historians generally treat the Match Girls' victory as a founding moment of what came to be called New Unionism, a wave of organizing among unskilled workers that included the far larger London dock strike the following year. It is worth being honest, though, about exactly what this victory did and did not achieve. Working conditions and wages improved substantially, and that improvement mattered enormously to the women living it. The underlying chemical hazard itself, white phosphorus, was not banned as a direct result of a strike, and British manufacturers continued using it for close to another 2 decades, until the country finally ratified an international agreement in the early 20th century that outlawed it for good. A real victory had been won. The poison, quite literally, kept being manufactured regardless. One other long, overdue loop closes in this same period. The Climbing Boys Act of 1875, described only in passing several chapters ago, had finally, effectively ended the use of children as chimney sweeps, nearly a full century after Percival Pott first documented the cancer of the trade, was giving its own workers, and almost 90 years after Parliament's first, toothless attempt at regulating the practice in 1788. Some fights in this story took less than a month to win. Others took the better part of a century, and cost the people waiting on them everything in between. Long before phosphorus poisoning became the rallying grievance, Bryant and May's workers had already been accumulating a long list of smaller daily humiliations that Besant's article also brought into public view. Workers were fined for talking, for dropping matches, even for having dirty feet, deductions taken directly from wages that were already barely sufficient to live on. Anger over these petty, grinding penalties had clearly been building for years before anyone actually walked out the door. Phosphorus lit the fuse. The fine system had already packed the barrel. Among the workers who helped organize the strike committee and the resulting union was a young matchmaker named Sarah Chapman, one of several ordinary factory floor workers who stepped into leadership roles almost overnight, with no prior experience running a union and no template to follow beyond their own shared refusal to keep accepting things as they were. History does not always remember the names of the people who actually do this kind of work. In this particular case, at least some of them have not been entirely forgotten. It is worth remembering the scale involved here as well. 1,400 workers walking out at once from a single factory represented the overwhelming majority of Bryant and May's entire workforce, meaning the strike was never a fringe protest by a disgruntled few. It was functionally the whole factory floor deciding, together and at once, that it had simply had enough. What should stay with you from this chapter, more than any single concession Bryant and May agreed to, is who actually delivered it. Not a parliamentary committee, not a royal commission, or a sympathetic aristocrat, or a well-meaning doctor publishing a paper nobody in power felt any urgency to act on. A group of teenage girls, organizing themselves, walked out a building that was quietly rotting their jaws, and within 3 weeks, forced a change that decades of documented medical evidence alone had failed to produce. Somewhere tonight, a woman is woken by a phone alarm timed to the minute, and before her feet even touch the floor, she has already opened an app to check what today's delivery targets require of her. She does not work in a mill. She has never seen a spinning frame in her life. And yet the shape of her morning, waking to a schedule she does not control, measured against a quota she did not set, would be entirely recognizable to the 9-year-old piecer this story opened with, nearly 2 centuries ago. The bell has not disappeared. It has simply gone digital. Warehouse workers today are tracked second by handheld scanners that measure how quickly they move between shelves. Algorithms flag anyone who pauses too long, and the resulting discipline is enforced not by an overseer with a strap, but by a dashboard reviewed by a manager who may never once meet the worker whose entire shift that dashboard just quietly graded. The specific horrors this story has spent 19 chapters documenting did not end either. They relocated. In April 2013, a garment factory building called Rana Plaza collapsed in Bangladesh, killing more than 1,100 workers inside it, after cracks had already appeared in its structure and workers were reportedly ordered back inside anyway, rather than lose a day's production. It is with an almost unbearable precision the same failure that killed the workers of Pemberton Mill in 1860. Only the location changed, and the number of dead was considerably higher. Child labor did not end either. It moved further down the supply chain, out toward the raw materials modern industry depends on but rarely discusses, including cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where investigators have repeatedly documented children working underground in conditions this story's 12th chapter would find entirely familiar. That cobalt, by the way, likely sits inside the very battery of the device you may be watching this documentary on right now. The underlying arithmetic driving all of it has not changed even slightly from the one this story described in its very first chapters. Find the cheapest possible labor, place it as far as possible from the customer's direct line of sight, and let distance do the moral work that conscience apparently cannot be relied upon to do on its own. Manchester's mill owners could at least see the smoke from their own windows. Today's arrangement does not even require that much proximity to guilt. Recall for a moment the 18th chapter of this story and its quiet argument that the deepest wound of the Industrial Revolution was never any single mill or mine, but the permanent conversion of a human life into hours that could be bought, sold, and taken away. That conversion did not reverse itself once child labor laws passed or workhouses closed. It simply found new instruments. The worker who once had to buy her own pocket watch to avoid a fine now carries a phone that tracks her location, her pace, and her break times voluntarily, because the job quietly requires the download as a condition of being hired at all. None of this is offered to suggest that nothing has improved, because a great deal genuinely has. Children in wealthy countries do not crawl beneath running machinery before dawn anymore. Match factories do not rot the jaws of teenage girls in London today. Mines have 2 shafts. These victories, hard-fought across 19 chapters by people who paid for them with testimony, strikes, and in a great many cases their own bodies, were real and they mattered, and this film has no interest in pretending otherwise. What this film is suggesting, as it closes, is narrower and considerably harder to sit with. The arrangement itself, the underlying logic that treats a human body as a cost to be minimized rather than a person to be protected, was never actually dismantled. It was pushed outward generation after generation, always toward whichever population currently has the least power to refuse it, and always just far enough from comfortable view that the people benefiting from it can honestly say they never saw the smoke. So return, one final time, to that 9-year-old girl from the story's very first chapter, pulling on a dress she never took off, walking through darkness toward a bell that governed every hour of her short life. The bell she heard is not silent. It rang for her, and it rang for the miners of Hartley and the Phosphorus Girls of Bow, and it is very likely ringing right now on a phone, in a warehouse, or a mine, somewhere just far enough away that you have simply never had to hear it. The mill is gone. It is worth asking, honestly, whether the arrangement ever actually left with it.